What's up, everybody? Peter Exodus O'Coffer here. Another episode of Classic Albums, and today I'm doing Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles. Classic album. Still a classic album. Gonna do some quick notes here because in the early 2000s, 2003, Rolling Stone did their top 500 albums of all time. And Sgt. Pepper was the number one album on that list in 2003. Since then, they've done a 2012 and a 2020 list. And now on the 2020 list, Sgt. Pepper has dropped to 24. Disagree with that. Maybe it's not number one. Their rationale was just they did a big reshuffling from the 2003. Some reshuffling, I think, in 2014, but big reshuffling in 2020 because of the decline of rock and roll and bringing in particularly R&B and hip hop, bringing it up the list. But I still think Sgt. Pepper should be a top five album because of the effect that it had on other artists at the time. I mean, when you talk about everybody, their jaws dropped, when in '67 when Sgt. Pepper dropped. Even the Motown folks were impressed with, and George Clinton talks about, with P-Funk talks about the effect that Sgt. Pepper had when he first heard it. So Sgt. Pepper was the first album that the Beatles did after their last tour. So this is when the Beatles said, hey, we're just going to be a studio band and we're doing our thing. What's significant about Sgt. Pepper and why I think it blew so many people's minds is that the album was done on a 4-track recorder. I remember watching Get Back on Disney Plus and how excited the Beatles were when they knew they were getting an 8-track recorder. I'm like, why are they so excited about an 8-track recorder? And then did the research, and the Beatles used an 8-track recorder for the first time on a White Album. So they did Sgt. Pepper on a 4-track album. And back in the late 80s and 90s, I had a 4-track. It was a cassette, not reel-to-reel like the Beatles used. But let me tell you, what the Beatles did on that album on the 4-track, they stretched it to the max. And I think that's the thing that really blew the fellow musicians away because they had no idea you could do all the things that the Beatles did on Sgt. Pepper on the 4-track. And, having experience in the 4-track, I'm just kind of like, even to this day, I'm blown away. Now, granted, the Beatles had the best sound engineers in the world working for them, and that's all they did from, Sgt. Pepper on out was just create music. It's still a feat and a masterpiece in its own way. And that's really, and when, classic albums, at least the albums I'm starting with are classic and are kind of move the needle because of the effect that they had on other musicians, and that's why I'm rolling with this album because it really it was a game changer. I mean, for many folks in the rock genre, there was rock and roll before Sgt. Pepper and rock and roll after, and also, I mean, this had a big effect, even pop, because I mean, now the Beatles are considered more, honestly, more of a pop band, and their influence is felt, in the realm of pop songwriting more so than rock and roll now. So Sgt. Pepper's released May 26, 1967, about 6 weeks after Jimi Hendrix's debut album, and I'll get to why I think that's important in a few minutes. But it was the first real concept album put out there, and the Beatles put a really a lot of effort into that iconic album cover as well. And so, I mean, most people, talk about it as, oh, it's a psychedelic album and whatnot. And the Beatles didn't invent psychedelia, but they kind of took psychedelic aspects that were kind of bubbling up from the scene, particularly in the Bay Area, and brought that into their music. Um, so, yeah, I mean, the concept album, and, you know, but let's move on. So there are like five big kind of classic songs off this album, um, or you got the hits, and then you got the second level, and you got the deep cuts. But with a little help from my friends, that's still one of the Beatles classics, "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds" and "Getting Better." But I want to talk about two of the classics off that album that really kind of moved the needle, and the first one is the title song, "Sergeant Pepper's," and just that opening guitar riff, and that's the Stones had uh, "I Can't Get No Satisfaction," and the Kinks had "You Really Got Me," but nobody had really. I mean, when you think heavy metal and heavy guitars, that's the first time really someone dropped some heavy guitar. Um, you know, um, Iron Butterflies and Gada Davida, precedes Sergeant Pepper, and Sunshine of Your Love by Cream precedes Sergeant Pepper. So, there was some hard rock out there before, but just, how those guitar chords hit in the beginning is reminiscent of what Black Sabbath would do a couple years later in 1970 with their two debut albums from that year. So I think it is significant. Sergeant Pepper to me is kind of like that song is kind of the birth of hard rock. Um, yeah. And the other song I want to, cover too is "A Day in the Life," and you know, I've I'm doing classic songs, and some of them I categorize as epic songs, and these later epic songs follow. There's certain aspects and patterns that they follow, but "A Day in the Life" is one of the early epic songs, and it's its own thing. It's almost like three chapters, and different chapters in one song. And John wrote most of "A Day in the Life." John Lennon and Paul McCartney wrote the middle part. But it's just what a journey, "A Day in the Life." It is one of the Beatles' most ambitious songs. It's very complex, yet it's very simple. Even to this day, I've heard this song thousands of times. You know, at I'm just awed by how good it is, and it was done on the four track. Again, so just to rewind. I mean, what recording on the four track? What was that like? I mean, so when I would do it, and this is kind of why the Beatles, when you watch Get Back, why they're rehearsing like they're doing the concert, because you have to kind of rehearse. You only have four tracks, even though in Get Back they were, they had an 8 track machine. And of course, now with digital audio workstations, whether it's Pro Tools or GarageBand, you have unlimited tracks. So when I would do four tracks, track one, I'd lay down my drums, track two with the bass, and then track three would be some sort of lead line. Now here's where it gets dicey. I only have one more track, and so then what you would do, what I would do in that fourth track is kind of mix the first three tracks onto that fourth track, and then start back at one again. So I would, maybe so I mix one, two, and three to four, and then track one I would uh, do something in the chorus, and track two something in the chorus, and lay vocals in that track three. And you you bounce down anymore on the cassette, the quality is going to go down. But once you bounce tracks, you can't really. I mean, you can EQ as far as the sound levels, but once you're kind of limited in what you can do once you bounce tracks, and so that's what's really amazing about Sergeant Pepper is. Even with all the sound engineers, I mean, you really have to have thought the song out very well, and know where you want to go with the song once you start bouncing the tracks, and that's what makes A Day in a Life so just mind blowing for someone who writes songs, because this was done on a 4 track, and all of this, you know, these 3 acts for A Day in a Life are, you know, you make a mistake, you can't really go back. You got to live with it, and that's why A Day in the Life is such a masterpiece. So those are the two just mind blowing songs on this album, and you put in the cover art, and they're a make believe band, and they're kind of these make believe characters in this make believe band. It's probably um, kind of they're kind of poking, I don't know, poking fun, but examining their fame. Because I mean, the Beatles, it was crazy. The screaming girls, and they couldn't go outside, and all this other stuff. George particularly hated it. But yeah, so that's kind of the background as to why this album is so good. John Lennon's interesting. He said it was of Sergeant Pepper. It's a concept album that goes nowhere. And if you follow John Lennon, he's pretty brutal in his critique of some of the Beatles stuff, including some of his own songs. I think John prefers. He thinks the White Album that's his favorite album. One of the things with this album is that it's a very Paul McCartney driven album. I mean, he had the concept. He got him in the studio, and this is what we're doing. And at some point in the Beatles, John became the creative force and the leader of the band. I mean, that's clearly present in Get Back. I don't know where this kind of kicks in. I'm still trying to figure out, as I delve into the Beatles' history. But certainly by Sergeant Pepper, I mean, clearly this is Paul's album. Everybody's kind of, you know, admitted that. Even John's admitted that. And I really think that, regardless of what you think about the White Album, at some point, when I really get a grasp of the Beatles' history, I might do the White Album. Interesting album. Some people love it. Some people think it's overrated. Um, I have a different reaction to it every time I listen to it. But here's the thing. I mean, it's a controversial album that in itself makes it a great piece of art. Um, but that's John Lennon's favorite Beatles album is the White Album. It's sprawling. It goes all over the place. My theory is that Paul kind of let off the gas, and it's like, okay, y'all can bring your stuff into this album. I mean, George Harrison was the youngest of the Beatles and always had problems getting his songs on albums, and he got more songs. Uh, on, I believe, I think the White Album is the album that he got the most songs on. I mean, While My Guitar Gently Weeps, comes to mind. Um, so yeah, that's the history. John Lennon thinks the album's overrated. I don't. The Beatles' peers at the time don't. But yeah, I think it's definitely a top 5 album now. Who replaced the Beatles and the #1 ranking in Rolling Stone from 2003. Both times now, 2014, 2020 was Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On," and hey, I can't argue with that. Marvin Gaye, that's a classic album too. So yeah, so that's my take on Sergeant Pepper. I still think I think number 24 is way too low. I know I forget where they rate the White Album. They might put it higher than or around Sergeant Pepper, which I don't agree with. Sergeant Pepper is a better album than the White Album. Regardless, as I said, when I listen to White Album, I have different reactions. I know Abbey Road is rated higher. I forget where as far as the Rolling Stone rankings go, and Abbey Road's a very good album. I mean, particularly that second side is one of the best sides of music ever recorded. Going back to, vinyl. Now we don't have sides, but when you look at albums put out in vinyl before the CD era, I mean, that second side of Abbey Road is good, and good luck in finding a better side. Um, so I think Abbey Road might, song for song might be better than, Sergeant Pepper, but it didn't have the mind blowing effect on fellow musicians like Sergeant Pepper did. So, and that's kind of where I'm coming from, how did you know, Sergeant Pepper was a game changer. I mean, everybody was like, whoa, and stepped back and, kind of it opened up a lot of eyes and like, hey, well, maybe if they can do that, maybe I can do this. So that's my take on Sergeant Pepper. I still, you know, top five, top 10 best of all time, easily, easily. So yeah, so I'm gonna go ahead and do some more stuff. Hit that the like button, subscribe to the channel. Got plenty more coming. Hey, I got 4 albums of my own. Check them out. They're here right on my channel here on YouTube. I'm on all the streaming services. Just Exodus, and I got 2 science fiction fantasy novels on Amazon, and also I have novella. So thanks for coming through, and see you next episode.